When most people think about planting things to attract and hold deer on their property, they probably picture lush, big green fields of things like clover and soybeans. And while those big fields definitely have their place, there may be something else that you can plant to draw them in from all of the neighboring properties. Having your own little orchard can definitely produce a lot of forage for deer. I mean, I'm talking tons of food. But there are some things you need to consider before you just go around digging a bunch of holes and throwing in some random fruit trees. So in this video, we're going to go over what fruit trees you should consider planting and how and where you should plant them on your property. But before we get into that, if this is your first time on this channel, consider hitting that subscribe button for more weekly videos about everything hunting and fishing. And the first thing you need to consider when planting your own orchard is what exactly you're going to plant. And the first step to doing that is checking out your growing zone. Knowing your growing zone will help you identify what trees will do best in your areas. Once you got that figured out, you can pretty much narrow down what it is you want to throw on the ground. Most apples, persimmons, pears, most of that will do fine in most of the whitetails range, but you want to definitely check the requirements of that tree species before you spend all that time and money on it. And trust me, it is definitely a lot of work. Unless you have all the specialized heavy equipment, which I'm assuming the vast majority of you don't, it's going to be a lot of elbow work. You're going to be out there getting your hands dirty. Now, one thing to keep in mind when planting your own orchard is that you need to plant multiple species of fruit trees in the same area for the best pollination and fruit production. Now, pears are becoming more and more popular throughout the whitetails range, but you could probably guess that my favorite's going to be just plain old persimmons. They become ripe during deer season, making them one of the best hunting locations. Now, if you're having trouble deciding what fruit trees you want to plant, you can definitely not go wrong with just not deciding on any one single species. I would throw in some apples, some pears, and persimmons all in the same plot, and you can ensure that you've got a productive, huntable location throughout all year. Now, there are several other tree species you can plant that I didn't mention earlier, and those are wild plums, mulberries, and pawpaws. If you've never heard of a pawpaw tree, a pawpaw looks like it's like a stubbier, fat banana. I don't really know of any other way to explain it, and they kind of have the same texture inside. Now, with pawpaws, they don't pollinate the same way that your other fruit trees do. They don't rely on bees and butterflies and stuff like that. Their pollinators are flies, and they kind of stink in the springtime, so just be aware of that. And now that you've figured out what trees you want to plant, you got to figure out where you want to plant them. You got to come up with a game plan that allows you to attract the most deer and be able to hunt that location. Pick a spot that is mostly flat and has good exposure. These trees need at least 6 hours of daylight to pollinate and grow and be healthy. So any place that's got an eastern, a southern, or a western exposure is great. Basically any place but a northern exposure. Now, you may think that a ridgetop would be a good idea to plant your orchard, and while they're not horrible places, they are more susceptible to drought conditions, so keep that in mind. If you do decide to plant an orchard up there, you just might have to water them when there's a long period of drought. Now, there are two really good spots to put your orchard, and that is in between bedding and a larger destination food plot. That way you can set up on them along their travel route, kind of the same concept as a hidey hole food plot. And the second good spot for them is on the northern side of a clover food plot. Now, I say northern side, but it has to have good exposure. Remember, northern exposure is not the best because it doesn't get gets the least amount of direct sunlight. But if you plant it on the edge of a clover food plot, those clovers tend to attract more of the pollinators, more butterflies and bees and all that stuff. So it could lead to more fruit production. So now that you know what you're planting and where, you need to think about the best way to plant them. Now, if you're going to buy your trees locally, you'll most likely find them in those small 5-gallon containers. But if you order them online, like I have to, you are probably going to get bare root seedlings. Try to avoid those larger, more mature trees that are in, they got the big burlap sack containing all the roots. While you do get a more mature tree, so you're more likely to get fruit production sooner, they are a lot more expensive, and it gets a little more complicated trying to plant such a big tree. I mean, sometimes they can be a lot more sensitive than just buying a bunch of cheap seedlings and throwing them in the ground. Now, if you order your trees online, those bare root seedlings, they need to get in the ground as soon as possible. Otherwise, those roots will dry out. And a tree with dry roots is a dead tree. If you have to wait a couple days, wrap the roots in a damp towel and store them in a cool place. Now for those trees that you get in those 5-gallon buckets, you need to dig a hole that is twice as wide and just as deep as the bucket. For those bare root trees, you need to dig the same dimension hole, but only as deep as the main root. Now backfill as needed and make sure the roots are spread out in a fan pattern away from the tree. You don't want all the roots clumped up in a ball right underneath the tree. You'll want to pat it down a little bit, water it to get rid of all those air pockets, and then add more dirt if needed. It's also a good idea to eliminate the weed competition within about a 5-foot radius of the tree. You don't have to use herbicide for this, and actually I don't recommend that you do. You could accidentally damage that tree unless you go early and kill all the weed competition with that herbicide and then come back once it's all dead. All you really need to do though is put a plastic sheet around the tree and then throw some mulch on top of it to help hold in that moisture. Now try to avoid using lime and fertilizer the first year, but if you just can't resist, you can use a really light application as long as it doesn't come in contact with the roots. That could easily kill a young tree. And now that you've spent all this time researching, preparing the site, digging the hole and all that, now you got to protect them. Invest in some tree cages or some fencing to help keep the deer out of them. For whatever reason, bucks just love to make their rubs on fruit trees, and of course the deer will eat them down to stems. Tree tubes are also a good idea, not only to protect the tree from damage, but they help hold in moisture and will encourage that tree to grow more vertically. So those are a few tips to setting up your own little fruit orchard on your hunting property. If you have any more tips, leave those down in the comments below. Be sure to hit that like button if you like this video, share it if you found it helpful, and make sure that you are subscribed so you can stay informed.